They claim to fight demons, but some say they created them. Picture this: a knock at your door. You open it to find a middle-aged couple, not priests, not scientists, just a husband and wife carrying holy water, a crucifix, and promises of salvation. Families across America welcomed Ed and Lorraine Warren into their homes, desperate for answers to the unexplainable. The Warrens said God sent them. Critics called them America's most gifted grifters. This isn't just another ghost story about creaky floorboards and cold spots. This is something darker, a tangled mess of faith, fear, and maybe even fraud. Because here's the thing: the scariest part of the Warren legacy isn't what they fought. It's what they left behind. Ed and Lorraine Warren. Those names probably ring a bell if you've ever watched a horror movie or scrolled through Paranormal YouTube at 3 a.m. Some folks swear they were spiritual warriors, chosen by God himself to battle evil. Others, they saw master manipulators who turned folklore and fear into cold, hard cash. Love them or hate them, you can't deny they carved their names deep into American paranormal history. And those marks, they're still bleeding. Before Hollywood made them famous, before The Conjuring turned them into household names, Ed and Lorraine were just a regular Connecticut couple with a very irregular obsession. Ed, a Navy vet and self-taught demonologist, claimed he'd seen shadows move in his childhood home, heard whispers behind closed doors that shouldn't have been there. Lorraine? She said she'd been psychic since age 9, seeing auras and sensing things that would make your skin crawl. Their marriage wasn't just a love story. It was a business partnership with the unknown. Without any formal training in theology or psychology, they did what nobody else dared. They treated the paranormal like it was real, and somehow convinced others to believe it too. Ed painted haunted houses, claiming he could feel the spirits trapped inside. Lorraine would tag along, knocking on doors, using those paintings as conversation starters before offering their real services. By 1952, they'd founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, America's first ghost hunting group, way before paranormal investigator was even a job title. They claimed to investigate over 10,000 hauntings. Their methods? Dramatic. Ed confronted spirits head-on. Lorraine fell into trances. They recorded everything: screams, cold spots, moving objects. But here's where it gets interesting. Wherever the Warrens went, the stories always got bigger, darker, more demonic. They became America's unofficial exorcists. Despite having zero authority from the Catholic Church, their verdict was almost always the same. This isn't a ghost, it's a demon. Before the TV interviews and book deals, before Hollywood came knocking, the Warrens were just two people with a paintbrush and a hunch. Their paranormal career didn't start with Latin chanting or dramatic exorcisms. It started with art. Ed painted haunted houses, and Lorraine had this uncanny ability to tell him which ones still had something lurking inside. Here's how it worked. Ed would dig up local legends, forgotten newspaper clippings about tragic deaths or mysterious disappearances. Then he'd sketch these houses obsessively, capturing every broken shutter, every shadow cast by overhanging trees. The paintings weren't just pretty pictures, they were bait. When Ed and Lorraine showed up at these houses, paintings in hand, doors opened, conversations started, and that's when things got weird. Neighbors whispered that Lorraine knew things she couldn't possibly know. She'd point to a specific room and describe a tragedy that happened there decades ago. She'd mention what the victim wore, what time to her typed in. Footsteps echoed upstairs, not vague stuff, specific details that made people's blood run cold. But not everyone bought it. Even back then, skeptics wondered, were the spirits really talking, or were the Warrens just really good at reading people? After all, local legends have a way of seeping into collective memory. Still, the Warrens pressed on, unfazed by doubters. As word spread, they started recording their sessions, sometimes audio, sometimes detailed notes scribbled with religious fervor. These documents became the backbone of their lectures and eventually their books. But looking back, you can see they weren't just investigating hauntings. They were building something bigger, a brand, a legacy. Some say this was their purest period, before the money and fame corrupted things. But even then, cracks were showing. Anonymous families later claimed the Warrens exaggerated their experiences, coached them to talk about demons when all they'd felt was a vague unease or bad dreams. Despite the controversy, Their lectures packed libraries and college auditoriums. Post-war America, still jittery from global conflict and Cold War paranoia, ate it up. If evil was real and tangible, then maybe faith meant something. The Warrens always positioned themselves as warriors of light in this cosmic battle. Behind the scenes, though, a divide was forming. Believers saw gifted spiritual guardians. Skeptics saw opportunists exploiting vulnerable people. Even today, online comment sections are battlegrounds. One person writes, "They saved my family." Another responds, "They saved their story for the book deal." So what were those early years really about? Truth-seeking or empire building? Because if Ed's paintings open doors, we have to ask, what exactly came through, and who was really in control? The spirits or the storytellers? By the 1970s, the Warrens weren't knocking on doors anymore. People were begging them to come in. To thousands of terrified families, Ed and Lorraine weren't just investigated. They were lifelines. The fear was real, and so were the stories that started piling up in their case files. This is when they transformed from curious ghost hunters into America's go-to demonologists. It all kicked off with a doll, not just any doll, Annabelle. The story goes like this. A nursing student gets a Raggedy Ann doll as a gift. Sweet, right? Wrong. The doll starts moving on its own, leaving cryptic notes, and allegedly tries to strangle someone. But here's the kicker. The Warrens didn't just say it was haunted. They said it was possessed by a demon. Big difference. They locked Annabelle in a glass case, surrounded her with prayers, and slapped on a warning, positively do not open. But they didn't hide her away in some vault. Nope. She sat right there in their home where guests could see her, turning fear into a tourist attraction. Then came the Perron family case, which you probably know from The Conjuring. Their Rhode Island farmhouse was supposedly ground zero for spectral attacks and mysterious crashes in the night. The Warrens diagnosed it as demonic naturally, but here's the thing. Andrea Perron, one of the daughters, later said the movie took major creative liberties. She claimed the real story was stranger and more personal, and that the Warrens barely scratched the surface. The pattern was always the same. Interview the family, perform some rituals, document everything, then often surprise, a book deal or media appearance. Critics called it exploitation. Believers called it salvation. Public opinion was splitting like a log under an axe. Some praised the Warrens as spiritual first responders. Others accused them of manipulating desperate families for profit. The really unsettling part, contradicting testimonies came not just from skeptics but from the families themselves. One family would swear the Warrens saved them. Another would claim Hay felt pressured to exaggerate for publicity. Still, the Warrens kept going. Their evidence collection grew. Ghostly photos, scratch marks appearing after prayers, recordings of inhuman growls. Reddit threads still dissect this stuff today. YouTube is flooded with debunking videos. Seasoned paranormal investigators question why there's no reproducible proof. Yet something about it all feels genuinely unsettling. Even skeptics admit feeling uneasy when diving into Warren cases, because whether the facts are real or not, the emotional aftermath is. Families genuinely believed they were in danger. Kids had nightmares. Pets died mysteriously. And when everyone else turned away, Ed and Lorraine showed up with a cross and a tape recorder. If one case launched the Warrens from local celebrities to global phenomena, it was Amityville, a gorgeous Long Island house with an ugly secret. 6 family members murdered by Ronald DeFeo Jr. in 1974. But what happened after the murders became one of the most controversial paranormal cases ever. Enter the Lutz family. They moved in a year after the murders, with all the original furniture still there. Creepy? Absolutely. Within days, they reported aggressive paranormal activity, flying objects, walls oozing slime, crucifixes flipping upside down. They even claimed to see demonic pigs staring through windows and invisible forces attacking their kids. After just 28 days, they fled. The Warrens showed up shortly after, though exactly when depends on who's telling the story. They described the house as oppressively evil, ancient, religiously malevolent. Lorraine said she felt a diabolical presence the second she walked in. Ed did his usual thing, went to the basement, challenged the entity, performed his rituals. They reported a supernatural circus of Catholic relics, demonic sightings, and psychic impressions of the murders replaying on loop. But here's where things get messy. While the Warrens painted Amityville as their most terrifying case, journalists and researchers started finding holes big enough to drive a truck through. Turns out, many of the Lutz's claims, the leftover furniture, the pig creatures, even the famous red room in the basement, were either exaggerated or completely made up. The real bombshell dropped in 1979. William Weber, DeFeo's lawyer, admitted the whole haunting was a hoax he cooked up with the Lutzes over many bottles of wine to sell books. Ouch. So where does that leave our demon-fighting duo? This was the moment people started questioning everything about the Warrens. Were they true believers who got conned, or were they in on it? Because even after the hoax went public, they doubled down. Lorraine insisted the house was still infested. Ed claimed to have evidence, though most of it was never properly examined or released. But Amityville stuck in the public consciousness anyway. Maybe it was the power of suggestion, maybe cultural timing, or maybe, as some still believe, something really did happen and the hoax story was the cover-up. Online discussions about Amityville are still toxic. YouTube comment sections are war zones. One camp defends the Warrens as victims of fraud. Another accuses them of knowingly exploiting a tragedy. Then came the horror franchise, books, films, remakes, merchandise. The Warrens are credited with bringing spiritual weight to what could have been just another ghost story. But their involvement cemented one uncomfortable truth. Whenever horror meets opportunity, the Warrens weren't far behind. The real power of Amityville wasn't its ghosts. It was the myth, the hysteria, and the disturbing marriage of trauma with commercial success. And right in the middle stood Ed and Lorraine Warren, holding a crucifix in one hand and a contract in the other. By the late 1970s, the Warrens had battled evil in New England and weathered the Amityville storm. Now they set their sights across the Atlantic to a modest council house in North London, the Enfield. The Poltergeist was about to become their most controversial international case. The Hodgson family claimed they were under attack. Chairs flew across rooms, toys moved by themselves, knocking sounds came from inside the walls. Young Janet Hodgson allegedly levitated and spoke in a gravelly man's voice, claiming to be a deceased former resident. British investigators documented dozens of incidents. The media went wild. Photos of Janet seemingly floating mid-air circulated globally. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a sensation. And naturally, the Warrens appeared. But here's where their credibility took another hit. Guy Lyon Playfair, one of the main investigators who'd spent over a year with the family, had some choice words about the American visitors. According to him, the Warrens weren't invited. They just showed up. They spent minimal time in the house, and Ed seemed more interested in making money than investigating. Yet years later, when The Conjuring 2 hit theaters, the Warrens were portrayed as central heroes battling demons and uncovering truths nobody else could see. The reality. Most serious Enfield researchers agree they were bit players at best, opportunists at worst. So why insert themselves into someone else's story? Was it ego? A need to expand their international reputation? Or did they genuinely believe they had something unique to offer? Online discussions still debate this. Some argue Lorraine had a psychic calling to be there. Others see a familiar pattern. Show up after the headlines, claim involvement, add it to the resume. Things got murkier when two Hodgson sisters later admitted to faking about 2% of the events, saying they felt pressured to perform for all the attention. But what's really interesting is how many people, families, journalists, researchers, started expressing frustration not just with the hauntings, but with the entire circus surrounding them. And guess who was always near the center ring? The Warren. Renz's reputation took another beating, not just from skeptics, but from fellow paranormal investigators who openly criticized their methods. Unlike field researchers who documented carefully and tested hypotheses, the Warrens arrived with conclusions already formed. It's demonic. Evil is here. We need holy water. This rigid approach started looking less like expertise and more like branding. If every haunting is demonic, The solution never changes. Neither does the fame. Still, believers defended them. They argued the spiritual battlefield doesn't need EMF readers and theories. It needs warriors with faith. But even among supporters, a troubling question emerged. Were the Warrens there to help or to hijack? The Enfield case split the paranormal community down the middle. On one side, researchers demanding evidence and peer review. On the other, the Warrens with their rosaries and absolute certainty. One group wanted to study evil, the other wanted to defeat it. And somewhere between those two goals, the truth got lost. By the 1980s, the Warrens weren't content with just haunted houses. They dragged the supernatural into the courtroom, turning a brutal murder case into legal history. This wasn't showmanship anymore. This was real tragedy meeting paranormal theater, and the Warrens were right in the middle of it. The case centered on Arna Cheyenne Johnson, a 19-year-old with a clean record who suddenly violently stabbed his landlord Alan Bono to death. The killing was savage, seemingly coming from nowhere. But what made it legendary wasn't the crime. It was the defense. The Warrens stepped forward with an incredible claim. Arna was possessed by a demon that had originally targeted young David Glatzel, his girlfriend's brother. According to them, the boy had shown classic possession signs, scratching, hissing, speaking in tongues. A priest had even attempted an exorcism, but the demon didn't leave. It jumped into Arna. When Arn killed Bono months later, the Warrens helped mount one of the most bizarre legal defenses ever attempted: not guilty by reason of demonic possession. The media went absolutely nuts. The judge? Not so much. He quickly shut down any supernatural defense, calling it legally inadmissible. The defense pivoted to self-defense, and Arnie was convicted of manslaughter. But the damage, or fame, was already done. Media frenzy, public fascination, and yes, eventual movie rights all followed. To some, this case exposed the dangerous limits of mixing faith with law. Others were disturbed by how quickly the Warrens inserted themselves into another high-profile tragedy. Critics argued they exploited a real murder to boost their demonology brand. Supporters claimed they provided crucial spiritual context for an otherwise inexplicable crime. Even today, online comments remain deeply divided. Some insist he never would have done it without demonic influence. Others counter, the only possession here was a convenient alibi. But this wasn't the Warrens' only dance with crime. Their files included numerous cases where mental illness, abuse, and trauma were reinterpreted as spiritual warfare. Therapists started noticing a pattern. Families who needed psychological help instead got religious dramatics, and the Warrens were usually there, documenting signs and reinforcing beliefs that these weren't mental health issues but demonic attacks. The overlap between Warren cases and vulnerable populations, grieving parents, traumatized children, unstable individuals, is impossible to ignore. While they claimed to help, the line between assistance and harm grew razor thin, yet their reputation somehow grew stronger. Newspapers called them real-life Ghostbusters. Talk shows welcomed Lorraine's soft warnings about everyday spiritual dangers, yet their reputation somehow grew stronger. Pers called them real-life Ghostbusters. Talk shows welcomed Lorraine's soft warnings about everyday spiritual dangers. Churches invited them to speak, while skeptics sharpened their knives for attack. And at the center of it all, a young man rotting in prison, a landlord 6 feet under, and a grieving family trying to make sense of it all, while the Warrens promoted yet another book about demonic possession. So what's more disturbing here? The idea that evil possessed a teenager and forced him to kill? Or that two people turned that tragedy into a bestseller, reinforcing their go-to narrative that demons lurk everywhere, and only the Warrens know how to fight them? The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Real human suffering transformed into paranormal entertainment. Mental health crises rebranded as spiritual warfare. And always, always, the Warrens emerged with new material for their next lecture, their next book, their next appearance. As the years rolled on and their fame grew, so did their collection. After decades of investigations, Ed and Lorraine had accumulated hundreds of supposedly cursed objects. Haunted dolls, satanic artifacts, cursed mirrors, voodoo items, all allegedly soaked in evil energy. But instead of destroying these dangerous relics, the Warrens did something that still makes people scratch their heads. They put them on display in their basement. The Warren Occult Museum, tucked away in Monroe, Connecticut, became infamous as one of the world's most haunted locations. Despite its modest appearance, just wooden shelves and dim lighting in a suburban basement, it drew visitors from around the globe. This wasn't just a room full of creepy stuff. It was a statement. Each item came with a horror story that the Warrens would dramatically recount during tours. And sitting at the heart of it all, behind thick glass like some demonic crown jewel, Annabelle. Not the Hollywood porcelain version, but a simple Raggedy Ann doll that looked like it belonged in a yard sale. Until you heard the stories. Visitors getting scratched. Strange accidents after mocking the doll. One guy who laughed at Annabelle during a tour supposedly died in a motorcycle crash hours later. The Warrens kept her locked up tight with prayers and that famous warning sign. Visitors left with mixed feelings. Some swore they felt chest pains, nausea, or icy cold spots. Others reported strings of bad luck afterward. These testimonies fed the legend that the museum wasn't just haunted, it was actively dangerous. But fame brought scrutiny, and boy, did people scrutinize. Online photos revealed troubling details. Many items had zero documentation proving they were actually involved in hauntings. The theatrical setup, crucifixes positioned just so, strategic red lighting, priest robes draped for maximum effect, looked more like a Hollywood prop room than a serious collection. Visitor reviews were all over the map. Some called it underwhelming or an obvious cash grab. Others were disturbed not by supernatural energy but by the commercialization of human trauma. Real stories of suicide, possession, and family destruction turned into a roadside attraction. Then came the legal hammer. In 2018, the museum was forced to close for violating everything from zoning laws to safety codes. Neighbors had complained for years about the tourist traffic. The property couldn't handle the liability of housing dangerous artifacts, or at least items claimed to be dangerous. But closure didn't kill the legend. Photos still circulate online. TikTokers analyze every shelf. Conspiracy theories exploded about where the objects went. Rumors even spread that Annabelle had escaped. She hadn't, but the internet loved it anyway. The really chilling part? Some visitors weren't there for entertainment. They came to pay respects, leaving flowers and prayers for families the Warrens had helped. These people didn't question the museum's authenticity. I believed with their whole hearts. That's what made the museum unforgettable. It wasn't just filled with supposedly haunted objects. It was filled with belief, raw, desperate belief in a darker world that the Warrens claimed to protect us from. But think about it. What kind of world is it where evil gets boxed up and labeled for display? Where human fear becomes a tourist attraction? And who really benefits when darkness isn't destroyed but carefully preserved for the next tour group? Ed Warren died in 2006. Lorraine followed in 2019. Many thought their controversial legacy would finally rest in peace. But what they left behind wasn't just dusty case files and fading VHS tapes. They left something far more powerful and persistent. They left a mythology that refuses to die. Today, the Warren name echoes louder than ever through pop culture. The Conjuring universe, built on their true case files, has become a billion-dollar franchise. Ironically, for a couple who once complained about Hollywood twisting the truth, their estate seems pretty comfortable with the creative liberties. The torch now passes to the Warren Legacy Foundation, run by their son-in-law Tony Spera and a team of investigators claiming to continue Ed and Lorraine's work. They manage the archives, conduct new investigations, and offer lectures about the dark forces still attacking families today. Depending on who you ask, they're either keeping a sacred tradition alive or milking a profitable ghost story. Controversy didn't die with the Warrens. It just evolved. Recent years brought lawsuits from former associates, allegations of image exploitation, and claims that NDAs kept criticism buried. Some insiders whispered that not everything was wholly behind the scenes, that families were sometimes pressured to go public, that story value trumped spiritual concerns. Modern investigators revisiting the famous cases find a troubling pattern, no verifiable evidence, no independent confirmation, just emotion and fear. And in the fear business, belief is everything. So what exactly is the Warren legacy built on? For thousands of people, it's built on hope. The Warrens listened when nobody else would. Not priests, not therapists, not cops. They gave structure to chaos, especially for families who felt cursed and completely alone. Maybe they really did face down evil that the rest of us can't comprehend. But for the growing community of online skeptics and researchers, their legacy is something else entirely. A carefully constructed empire of suggestion, turning real tragedy into profitable entertainment. Even supporters can't ignore the pattern. Unlikely possession, escalation, demonic diagnosis, religious ritual, then inevitably, a book, a tour, a movie. Once you see the formula, it's hard not to wonder if the evil they spent their lives fighting was sometimes the very engine that fueled their fame. Yet despite every contradiction, every debunked claim, every expose calling them frauds, the Warrens continue to inspire fierce belief. Maybe that's the most terrifying truth of all, that the line between salvation and performance is invisible to those who desperately need to believe. So who were Ed and Lorraine Warren really? Guides through the shadow world, or architects of their own dark mythology? Whatever you believe, remember this. The museum may be closed, the tapes may be fuzzy with age, the prayers may have faded from the air, but the name Warren still echoes in the dark. And some doors, once opened, never truly close. Because in the end, the Warrens didn't just investigate the paranormal, they became it. And their greatest trick wasn't fighting demons, it was making sure we'd never stop looking for them.